Because I was not.
John, we're all hearing you. You're not muted.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to, hold on a second here.
Eric, when you're ready, if you just give me some kind of a cue, and I'm good. Whenever you're ready.
Yeah, you'll see when the video comes on. I can't talk anymore.
Okay.
That's not what happened.
Yeah. Oh, that's so weird. I was,
Ed, why don't you begin?
hold on just one second.
That's not. Yeah, but you know.
I think Stuart starts first.
Ready?
Doesn't matter.
I am Ned White, the moderator for today's Friends of Cedarmere webinar, Poetry in a Time of Crisis. On behalf of the entire board, I extend you a warm welcome as we celebrate William Cullen Bryant's 226th birthday. We're celebrating 2 days early because of the national election on Tuesday, November 3rd, his actual birthday. Bryant, who lived from 1794 to 1878, was the editor of the New York Evening Post, a highly influential New York newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton. Bryant was by all accounts the most important civic leader of his time, the moving force behind the creation of Central Park and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the most popular American poet of the 19th century. Cedarmere, Bryant's home, is located on 7 acres adjacent to Hempstead Harbor on the north shore of New York's Long Island. Listed on the National Historic Register, it is a Nassau County park, and the grounds are open to the public under COVID-19 guidelines. Created in 2009, the nonprofit Friends of Cedarmere was established to support the restoration of his house and gardens and to provide public programming that will make Bryant's many diverse accomplishments better known. Among other goals, this webinar is dedicated to raising funds to restore Bryant's Gothic Revival Mill at Cedarmere, built in 1862, during the crucial Civil War period in American history that we will be illuminating today in his honor. It is a remarkable coincidence, but significant one, that Bryant's birthday falls this year on the day of a momentous presidential election. The conjunction of these events is meaningful because through powerful editorials, Bryant had the attention of Abraham Lincoln and the nation during the Civil War, a period in which America faced a constitutional crisis similar to our own. By sharing the ways in which Bryant helped resolve the crisis that shook the foundations of American democracy in his day, we can show that the times we are living in are not the only troubled days in American history, and that the light and peace of a revitalized democracy can indeed be restored.
The peaceful transfer of power is the most important feature of our democracy. It was established in 1792 with President George Washington's refusal to remain in office and become a king. Trying to win an election by suppressing the vote or sowing distrust in the process and threatening intimidation at polling places also violates the constitutional principle of government for and by the people. It is an attempt to bring back a past when some considered America to be great, but when Black Americans were prevented from voting. Martin Luther King Jr. quoted Bryant in his 1957 speech, "Give us the ballot," asserting, "Truth, crushed to earth, will rise again." William Cullen Bryant, New York's most important civic leader, was chosen to introduce an obscure first-term senator, Abraham Lincoln, as the 1860 presidential candidate at New York City's Cooper Union. The national recognition Bryant afforded him and Bryant's editorial support were significant factors in his election. Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 presidential election on the platform of preventing the spread of slavery.
My brother.
Alarmed by Lincoln's victory, South Carolina quickly seceded from the Union, and in February 1861, under Jefferson Davis as president, the Confederate States formed a new nation. This led to the outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861. The South's attempt to create two nations out of one to preserve slavery are reminiscent of efforts today to divide the United States into blue and red states, in effect creating two nations, not one America. Lincoln, a self-educated man with a passion for poetry, had not realized that Bryant, one of his favorite poets, would be introducing him to the nation at Cooper Union. He especially loved Thanatopsis, Bryant's best-known poem, which Lincoln had committed to memory as a young man. After his address, he said it was worth coming all the way from Springfield, Illinois, to New York to meet a man like Bryant. Lincoln gathered strength from the concluding words of Bryant's poem about the need to face death courageously. That advice would become important to Lincoln because he was to confront the threat of death many times before he was finally assassinated.
So live, that when thy summons come to join the innumerable caravan which moves to that mysterious realm, where each shall take his chamber in the silent halls of death, thou go not, like the quarry slave at night, scourged to his dungeon, but sustained and soothed by unflinching trust, approach thy grave, like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him, and lies down, to pleasant dreams.
Lincoln's admiration for Bryant as a poet and important newspaper editor gave Bryant the authority to provide counsel to Lincoln, even when the advice was uncomfortable. We know from Bryant's letters to Lincoln and the editorials in the New York Evening Post that he felt free to criticize the president. On August 25th, 1862, in an editorial, Mr. President's Letter, Bryant expressed his concern that Lincoln's approach to the war and the emancipation of slaves was overly cautious. But he reminded his readers that he admired Lincoln's conscientious honesty and obvious sagacity. Lincoln expert Harold Holzer acknowledges that Lincoln imposed restrictions on the press. The harsh necessities of war, Bryant wrote in an editorial, made that understandable, but he nevertheless insisted that the press had the right to criticize the president respectfully. Today's criticism of the handling of the pandemic, which has some of the elements of a war, is sometimes labeled fake news, seeking to deflect government responsibility for dealing with it rather than to protect the country, which was Lincoln's purpose. In the early years of the war, when the Union was losing in a bloodbath, Bryant was too distressed to write much poetry. The poems he did write are not serious ones, like Stella and the Little People in the Snow. In fact, Bryant sharply rebuffs his close friend Catherine Sedgwick for praising one of these poems, writing in a letter that it was mere fantasy. Thinking about the war is too painful for me, he said. The 3rd of November, 1861, written by Bryant to celebrate his 67th birthday, has for a poet known for his love of nature, a surprisingly negative description of the natural world at his Cedarmere retreat in Long Island, and of his favorite season of the year, which was autumn.
Dreary is the time when the woodland leaves are cast, when upon the hillside, all hardened into iron, howling like a wolf, flies the famished northern blast.
It is striking that on his birthday, Bryant chose to describe nature as inanimate and threatening, conveys these unusually negative feelings through images of fallen leaves that once alive have turned into iron, and by comparing the threatening winds to a hungry wolf bent on devouring everything. In this way, Bryant's profound anxiety about the war's uncertain outcome is being exposed. Today's conflicting messages about COVID-19 and the many deaths it has caused, a third of those who died in the Civil War, and rising every day, numb us temporarily to its realities, similar to Bryant's hesitation expressing his feelings in poetry during the early stages of the war. With a jolt, we may be awakened by the casual remark that stay-at-home orders to protect people from the virus are, quote, the strongest attack on civil liberties since slavery, or on hearing of a proposed Bill of Rights for college students to party. Bryant is able to confront the evils of slavery and the destruction of the Union more directly in his editorials because they are much less personal than his poetry. However, Bryant's editorials are distinctive compared to those of other newspaper editors because he is a poet. They are written in a style that Gilbert H. Muller, Bryant's most recent biographer, calls poetic prose. In a few plain words of advice, an editorial from May 21st, 1860, Bryant effectively uses repetition to attack the supporters of slavery before the war had begun. He writes, "Gentlemen of the South, although you were a mere minority, you were able to maintain slavery by your habits of bullying and personal intimidation. You ought to see by this time, gentlemen of the South, that the sooner you abandon your political struggle in favor of slavery, the better it will be for you." And near the end of the war, to celebrate General Sherman's capture of Savannah, Bryant uses figurative language much more common in poetry than in prose. in Christmas Thoughts, an editorial for December 25th, 1864. A dragon, a biblical figure, stands for the devil incarnate or slavery. Quote, when the slaveholders in their madness lifted their combined hands against the Union, we saw the dragon in all its hideousness, and how it not only crushed one race in its scaly folds, but how it was ready to rear its fanged and crested head against the very life of the Republic. In the later stages of the Civil War, with the news of the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st through the 3rd, 1863, Bryant's poems begin to confront the war's painful realities, the destruction of nature and human life, even though he still believes strongly that preserving the Union and ending slavery are righteous. For Bryant, these tragedies culminate with President Lincoln's assassination on April 15th, 1865, at the hand of a man who could not abide the defeat of the South and the end of slavery. In The Poet, 1863, written in his library at Cedarmere, Bryant explains for the first time his creative process and demonstrates his new willingness to grapple with his feelings about the war. Bryant had held two different concepts of poetry, which were influenced by his being born at the end of the 18th century. Thanatopsis, his earliest poem, dating in its complete form from 1821, is rational and balanced in the neoclassical tradition of Alexander Pope. To a Waterfowl, universally regarded as his greatest poem and one of the most important in the English language, is an ode, a form influenced by John Keats, an early 19th century poet. The poet first articulates the romantic theory that poetry should be based on emotion recollected in tranquility, to use William Wordsworth's phrase. The last part, however, indicates that the Civil War has changed Bryant's view of poetry. A poem must express powerful emotions immediately.
Of tempests wouldst the poet sing, or tell of battles, make thyself a part of the great tumult. Cling to the tossed wreck with terror in thy heart. Scale with the assaulting host the rampart's height, and strike and struggle in the thickest fight.
Bryant's view of the poet's role has shifted from expressing the theory of writing from restrained emotions recollected in tranquility to the need to write about battles in spite of the terror he acknowledges. The poet gathers his courage and participates symbolically in the fiercest fight for righteous victory. The poet identifies with the Union soldiers on the battlefield and urges his readers to do likewise. The poet's role in society is to teach as well as to delight. This shift in focus is likely to have been influenced by the Union soldiers' hard-fought victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July of 1863. As the end of the war approaches, Bryant makes his role explicit in his editorial, The Soldiers of the Union Army, for New Year's Day, 1865. He offers his warmest congratulations for what you have accomplished, soldiers. This is your work. These are your heroic achievements, and for these a grateful country gives you its thanks. Be assured that the crowning achievement cannot be far distant. The Path, a companion piece to the poet, also written in the Cedarmere Library, seems the opposite in tone, describing the sweet autumn sunshine on the day Bryant and his wife finished making a path from his house with its domestic gardens up the hill into the wilder Cedarmere woods. He sees the narrow path that they have completed as a hopeful symbol of connection between all mankind, no matter where they live, by implication, the North and the South. Although that optimism is dashed at the end with its explicit reference to the geographical divisions during the Civil War.
O mighty instinct that thou dost unite earth's neighborhoods and tribes with friendly bands. What guilt is theirs who in their greed or spite undo thy holy work with violent hands, and post their squadrons cursed in war's grim trade to bar the ways where mutual succor made.
Bryant's later poems, written from 1864 to 1866, do not end with abrupt references to the war. Rather, they are unified, connecting the urgent need to eliminate slavery and restore the nation with the high cost of achieving these goals in lives lost and destruction of the natural world. These poems were written at Cedarmere, away from the pressures of Bryant's New York editorial office, and were published in the Atlantic Monthly, an important liberal journal that had printed Julia Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic. The Atlantic is known today for its articles raising alarm about the impending constitutional crisis and the alleged disrespect of the World War II dead.
The two most powerful Civil War poems Bryant wrote are The Return of the Birds, March 1864, and My Autumn Walk, October 1864. They forcefully express the outrage at the suffering and the loss of human life that was required to preserve the Union and end slavery. The Civil War, the first modern industrialized war, resulted in terrible destruction of nature. Bryant is particularly sensitive to this because he is the most important American poet of nature who vividly conveys the uniqueness of the American landscape. Bryant often described in his poetry the beauty, abundance, and diversity of our land and wildlife, both of which play a major role in forming the American character. In the 1830s, for example, he wrote to Cole, the painter, Departing for Europe, a tribute to Thomas Cole, his friend, the Hudson River School artist, in which he contrasts the wild American landscape to that of Europe's, which had been cultivated and built upon for hundreds of years.
Thine eyes shall see the light of distant skies, yet Cole, thy heart shall bear to Europe's strand a living image of our own bright land, such as on thy glorious canvas lies. Lone lakes, savannas where the bison roves, skies where the desert eagle wheels and screams, spring bloom and autumn blaze of boundless groves.
The Return of the Birds conveys the war's impact on nature through the premature return of birds from the South, their habitat having been decimated. They have come back before their usual return in spring, echoing the loss of life of the battlefield.
For there is heard the bugle blast, the booming gun, the jarring drum, and on their chargers, spurring fast, armed warriors come and go. In groves where you used to sing, in orchards where you had your birth, 1,000 glittering axes swing to smite the trees to earth. Ye love the fields by plowmen trod, but there where sprouts the beechen spray, the soldier only breaks the sod to hide the slain away. And midland plain and ocean strand shall thunder, glory to the brave, peace to the torn and bleeding land, and freedom to the slave.
My Autumn Walk, Bryant's most powerful and innovative Civil War poem, was set to music for the celebration of Bryant's 200th birthday in 1994. As he walks through the Cedarmere landscape on an autumn day, he notices the blood red banner of the mock grape hung out on the cedar tree. which reminds him of the terrible cost the young men and their families are paying, even though it is a righteous war.
Beautiful is the death sleep of those who bravely fight in their country's holy quarrel and perish for the right. But who should comfort the living, the light of whose homes is gone, the bride that early widowed lives broken-hearted on? And I think of the days of slaughter and the night sky red with flames on the Chattahoochee meadows and the wasted banks of the James. But the living buds are there with folded flower and foliage to sprout in a kinder air.
The last stanza signals Bryant's abiding faith that peace will come by shifting from the description of autumn's falling leaves to the buds of spring still remaining on the branches. The buds represent figuratively the inevitability of spring's growth, the new life, and peace will come again. Bryant's editorials and letters are filled with cogent arguments about why slavery is evil and must end. Such references in his poetry, however, are brief until after the war has ended and the country must face reconstruction. In The Death of Slavery, written in May of 1866, written at Cedarmere and published in The Atlantic, Bryant describes the many kinds of suffering, both physical and psychological, that were imposed on slaves, other human beings. Even though the war has been won and the slaves have been declared free, he writes this poem because he fears America will forget about the scars that remain. He refers to the pyramids that the slaves built in ancient Egypt because he believed that history is cyclical and that slavery can return. Today, rather than the pyramids, Americans are more likely to refer to the fact that the White House was built by slaves.
Oh, your great wrong, that though the slow-paced years didst hold thy millions fettered, and didst wield the scourge that drove the laborer in the field, and turns a stony gaze on human tears. Thy cruel reign is o'er, thy bondsmen crouch no more, in terror at the menace of thine eye. For he who marks the bounds of guilty power, long suffering, hath heard thy captives cry, and touched his shackles at the appointed hour. And lo, they fall, and he whose limbs galled stands in his native manhood disenthralled.
As early as 1836, a Bryant editorial supports the rights of workers to form unions and to strike. This idea resonates in his very unusual choice of the word laborer in the third line to describe that slaves were forced to work in the fields. He opposed slavery in part because it undermines free labor.
Thou did not spare life's tenderest ties, but cruelly didst part husband and wife, and from a mother's heart didst wrest her children, deaf to shriek and prayer.
The final line of The Death of Slavery makes clear that Bryant intends the poem to be a warning to the coming times. The rise of white supremacy movements in America today and their violent attacks of persons of color suggests that distinct possibility. The important events of April 1865 are tragic in their juxtapositions. On April 4th, President Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address. On April 9th, General Lee surrendered, ending the war. Less than a week later, Lincoln was assassinated on April 15th. And on April 25th, at his funeral in New York's City Hall Park, Bryant is chosen to give his benediction. He praises Lincoln for his honesty, his singleness of purpose, his tender heart and clear head, and his ardent desire to do what's most benefit for his countrymen. Later that evening, after Lincoln's remains had left New York for Springfield, the Unitarian minister, Samuel Osgood, presided over a memorial service in Union Square and read Bryant's elegy, The Death of Lincoln. Bryant later published it on the front page of the New York Evening Post.
Oh, slow to smite and swift to spare, gentle and merciful and just, who in the fear of God did spare the sword of power, a nation's trust. In sorrow by the bier we stand, amid the awe that hushes all, and speak the anguish of the land that shook with horror at thy fall. Thy task is done, the bound are free. We bear thee to an honored grave, whose proudest monument shall be the broken fetters of the slave. Pure was thy life, its bloody close hast placed thee with the sons of light, among the noble host of those who perished in the cause of right.
In the opening stanza, Bryant echoes the words of Lincoln's second inaugural address, quote, "with malice towards none, with charity for all, and with firmness in the right," unquote. Bryant paraphrases his description of Lincoln's character in the memorial benediction. He implies Lincoln's cool head helped him to stand unwavering for what was right, and his good heart allowed him to forgive and offer help to those who had been defeated. Lincoln's aim was to prepare the nation for healing, something that he would not live to see. In the elegy, Bryant expresses his admiration for Lincoln's commitment to freeing the slaves, his greatest achievement for not endorsing revenge. Bryant's editorial, "What Should Happen to Jefferson Davis," indicates that he felt a measure of punishment was due, not to the Confederate soldiers, but to those who were mostly directly responsible for leading the effort to destroy the nation, and were willing to preserve slavery at the cost of many, many lives on all sides. Historians currently estimate that 750,000 died. Lincoln's assassination propels Bryant in his sober and powerful elegy to show that Lincoln was the tragic figure martyred for his country, and implied that he will join others in heaven who died for what is right. The Civil War pulled back the curtain on Southern gentility and impressive plantations, revealing for those willing to see its slavery's darker side, and that it provided an endless supply of forced labor to enrich the few. This was a fact that disturbed Bryant profoundly. The war not only exposed that slavery was cruel and inhumane, but also demonstrated a profound blindness and selfishness, disregard
I'm listening.
on how incompatible slavery is with
Yes.
the American ideals set forth
You're
in the
wrong.
Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and have the right to life,
No,
liberty,
you're
and
wrong.
happiness.
You
Today's
are
suffering
wrong.
caused by the pandemic, a great deal of it.
I'm listening.
Today's suffering caused by the pandemic, a great deal of it unnecessary, exposes America's underlying economic inequality and racism. Some people will get sick and die because of a lack of health insurance or inferior care, while others have a much better chance of survival because of their wealth and a safer place to live. Poverty fosters crowded living conditions, which lead to serious underlying health problems like heart disease, asthma, and diabetes, making poor people much more vulnerable to dying from COVID-19. It should be no surprise that the greatest percentage of those who get sick and die are Black and Brown and Native Americans. The pandemic, though negative, offers the possibility of change if we recognize the consequences of systemic racism. If a greater number of people become aware of these problems, too long pushed out of sight, they are much more likely to insist that they be addressed. Journalists like Bryant and newspapers like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, and journals like The Atlantic in Bryant's time and today play an important role in revealing hard truths. They are not the enemies of the people. Hold on a second. The increasing economic inequality of the last 50 years has driven some people to the far right and others to the left, not unlike the split in Bryant's time between those who supported slavery and those who wanted it to end. In these circumstances, the center cannot hold and compromise is not possible. Like the unfortunate bloodletting of the Civil War, the pandemic's economic impact on those who have been laid off, whose jobs will not return, or whose hours have been cut, can be overcome through wise and compassionate leadership. with the aim of creating a more equitable society. It should help heal the divisions, the deep divisions which exist today, created by resentment and frustration with pervasive unfairness and injustice. Compassion for the suffering and sympathetic understanding of the difficulties of others and a willingness to help is the key to change necessary for healing. Lincoln understood the grief of families who lost sons, husbands, and loved ones in the war on both sides because of his own struggles without the means for education and the death of his young son, Willie. Poets need to be able to see the lives of other people clearly in order to write about life truthfully. Bryant grew as a poet, though emphasizing in his later poems with those who suffered as a result of the war and by imagining what slaves had been forced to endure. On the day that he learned that Lincoln had died, Bryant expressed profound grief. That evening, a friend witnessed him standing alone in the dark at the foot of George Washington's statue in Union Square. In an editorial, quote, "George Washington's birthday, his counsels," unquote, Bryant shares his strongly held belief that presidents capable of sacrifice and empathy like Washington and Lincoln are crucial to democracy's survival.
In his November 1863 Gettysburg Address, oh, I'm sorry, Eric, can you please mute that participant, that 1201-392402? Thank you. Okay. In his November 1863 Gettysburg Address, Lincoln turns to our beginnings as a nation for inspiration and hope during hard times. Facing squarely the reality that many died on the battlefield at Gettysburg, Lincoln evokes our creation of a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He ends his brief address with the resolution still relevant today, that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new burst of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth.
Friends of Cedarmere urge you to exercise your sacred right as an American. If you have not already voted, please do so on November 3rd, William Cullen Bryant's 226th birthday. Thank you for joining us for Poetry in a Time of Crisis. The webinar is being recorded on Zoom and will be available on YouTube. The Friends of Cedarmere has created a YouTube page. There will be instructions on our Facebook page about how to get the YouTube video so that it may be watched by those who missed the live presentation. We welcome your support for this kind of programming through becoming a member of Friends of Cedarmere at the website friendsofcedarmere.org. We also invite donations for the ongoing renovation of Bryant's 1862 mill, built during a critical time in American history, which the webinar has sought to illuminate. Contact Kareem El-Hanidi, treasurer, kareem@connectivityservices.com, or contribute by mailing a check to the Friends of Cedarmere, P.O. Box 214, Roslyn, New York, 115760214. Some credits: webinar readers have been Kevin Anglis and Stephanie Mara and myself. Musical piece, Fugal Brief for RBG, was composed by Paul Baserman, played by Stuart Waters. Historical images were produced by Tom Powell and displayed by Eric Swenson, who is also our technical director. Technical assistance was provided by Kareem El-Hanidi and Vanessa Cruz. The script was written by Bob Sargent with assistance from Carol Vogt, Kevin Anglis, Paul Baserman, Sebastian Lee, Eric Swenson, and Ned White. Bryant's poems and quotes were from the following sources: Poems by William Cullen Bryant, collected and arranged by the author, 1878. Gilbert H. Muller's Abraham Lincoln and William Cullen Bryant, Their Civil War, 2017. Gerald H. Muller's William Cullen Bryant, Author of America, 2008, and Charles H. Brown's William Cullen Bryant, 1971. The Friends of Cedarmere invite you to join us for the webinar's companion piece, which we are co-sponsoring. It's the first showing of a multidisciplinary art film created by Beth Jacoby of Dance Visions, New York. The film depicts the dramatic evening section of Kira Jacoby's three-part poem, The Subject and Power, in a version called Zoetropsis, site-specific to Bryant's Cedarmere estate, combining dance, poetry, and music. It is in the tradition of Bryant's most famous poem, Thanatopsis, a meditation on the cycles of life. The cyclical theme has been chosen for its relevance to the fundraising drive to restore the water wheel at Bryant's 1862 mill. The film's title, Zoetropsis, is drawn from an early animation technique and depicts life as a wheel. For information about this event, please visit dancevisionsny.org and click on the ticket information button for Evening the Film, site-specific for Cedarmere, November 7, 2020, 7:30 p.m. through Cedarmere's YouTube channel. This will allow you to request the link to register and make a donation. Registering will enable you to receive a YouTube link that will be good from 7 p.m. Saturday, November 7 through 10 p.m. Sunday, November 8. A portion of the proceeds are dedicated to Friends of Cedarmere. In a moment, Stuart Waters will begin to bring our program to a close with variations on Fugal Brief for RBG by Paul Baserman. During this musical interlude, we invite you to use the Zoom chat to submit any questions or comments that were prompted by the webinar. Alternatively, you can send us questions or comments via email to info@friendsofcedarmere.org. In either case, we will get back to you at a later time. Following this musical interlude, John Dawson, president of Friends of Cedarmere, will offer brief concluding remarks. Thank you for watching Poetry in a Time of Crisis, concerning Bryant's important role as poet and journalist during a constitutional crisis similar to our own. The Friends of Cedarmere sincerely hope that recounting Bryant's experience during a difficult time in our country's history has enlightened you and raised your spirit.
Thank you very much, Stuart. John, are you available?
Yes, I am. I haven't been able to activate my picture, but I am ready, as I was earlier.
Okay. We're ready if you'd like to give some final remarks.
Well, I just want to thank those who participated in this program. It's a little unusual for us, something new that we perhaps can use again and again. And I want to encourage you to make donations to the Friends of Cedarmere so that we can redo the mill and enjoy the new, there it is, enjoy the new mill. Thank you so much. Take care.